We've had a good lunch, but it's time for plain speaking. This is instead of pudding. I noticed that pudding had been left out, clearly on the grounds that that would be far too sweet. So take this traditional thing that you have after lunch in this bit of the world is a club savoury. Think of it as particularly rank with lots of anchovy and Worcester sauce, because that's what I'm giving you now. So what has gone wrong? Why is the world's oldest political party now facing oblivion? Let's be absolutely clear. It is in a whisker. If it continues like this, by next May's elections, let me give you a prediction, barely a single Conservative candidate will be elected. Whole associations will start going over to reform. Funding will dry up. That's what happens when parties come to an end. Because, ladies and gentlemen, no one, nothing is eternal. Nothing is a right to go on forever. So, what's happened? Let's try and analyze it. Because I think if we understand what's happened, if we understand, I would go further, the basic problem with the word conservative, we might begin to get a sense of what's happened, how we can draw a line under it, and above all, the fact that we've got a complete precedent for a very similar turn round. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not exactly the oldest here, but nor, I suspect, am I the youngest. So there are people, I think, hands up, whose memories of the 70s are fresh. Reasonable number. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through a 50th anniversary experience. Britain is reliving the 1970s. Let me quickly recap do we all realise this is the 50th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher becoming leader of the Conservative Party? The grand anniversary dinner, it's also, I think, the 100th year of her birth. The grand celebratory dinner will be held at Guildhall in a few weeks' time. There was clearly a desperate problem about filling places. I've been invited by at least 3 separate organisations, which suggests that the Guildhall won't exactly be pulsating, but there we are. That's the fate when you're slightly over the top. What was Margaret Thatcher about? Why did she happen? Why does she become leader of the Conservative Party, and in what circumstances? Remember, and again, it's very important to tell the truth, Margaret Thatcher herself, up to the point at which she became leader of the Conservative Party, was a deeply unimpressive politician. She was probably the worst Secretary of State for Education in our history. She closes more grammar schools than anybody else. In other words, like a typical minister, she does what her civil servants tell her to. She goes with the basic drift. So what is it that turns Margaret, admittedly she was milk snatcher and all the rest of it, but what is it that turns Margaret from this provincial, ordinary, not very reflective politician into one of the genuinely great prime ministers? And there've been less than half a dozen of them in the 200-odd year history of the office. Well, you know the standard saying, behind every strong man there is an even stronger woman. In Margaret Thatcher's case, it was the other way round. And it wasn't Dennis with his treble gins and tonic. It was instead Sir Keith Joseph with his 3 volumes of carefully argued articles. And Joseph is a remarkable figure. We hear a lot about Conservative politicians, particularly the man on whom I'd put my money, Robert Jenrick, having had Damascene conversions, and we sneer at them. I always remind people that the original Damascene conversion of St. Paul was actually quite successful. St. Paul, much more than Jesus, invents Christianity in terms of Christian gospel and Christian practice and the nature of the church. It's St. Paul. Well, the original Tory Damascene conversion is Sir Keith Joseph. In 1974, after having been a leading minister in the Edward Heath government, Keith Joseph writes a famous essay in which there are two key sentences. He says, "I have been a member of the Conservative Party, and I have done nothing conservative. I have been a member of a Conservative cabinet that has done even less that's conservative." That is in 1974-5. Because what we've got to understand is that right from the beginning, conservatism was a surrender to change. This awkward term of the relationship of the Tory party to the Conservative Party. You're Rutland people, you're in the Midlands. I know you hate being called the Midlands, but there we are. Can I ask, does anybody, this is a hint, know when the term Conservative Party is invented? Anybody? Tamworth Manifesto, 1835, by Sir Robert Peel, who is probably the most intelligent leader that the party has ever had. That extraordinary thing, a double first at Oxford in both mathematics and classics. In those days, politicians were clever. God, what a difference it makes, but there we are. We now have David Lammy. David Lammy, can you imagine, first at the desk of Palmerston, and now wearing the same robes as Thomas More and Cardinal Wolsey, but there we are. And they talk about the fall of a nation. But what the Tamworth Manifesto was about was accepting the end of the Tory party. The old Tory party had been the party that believed in the ancient, unreformed constitution, in the exclusion of Roman Catholics from public life, and so on. And that dies the death between 1830 and 1832. It dies the death, with Catholic emancipation actually carried out by the Duke of Wellington and Robert Peel himself, and then in 1832 carried out over the dead body of the Duke of Wellington, the Great Reform Act of 1832, which fundamentally changes the franchise. So the Conservative Party begins with Robert Peel in the Tamworth Manifesto saying, "I accept change. I accept a huge radical change." The question in all of our minds is, when do you stop? Where do you stop? If we're conservative, it basically means, doesn't it, that we're not over keen on change. I mean, what else should it mean? It means that you actually believe that previous history, previous experience, tradition matters. It means that you're not, I'm going to give you another naughty word. It said I was a terribly improper person. I'm going to give you another word. It sounds very much like paedophilia, but I assure you it's not. It's called neophilia, the worship of the new. And ladies and gentlemen, I think it's, generally speaking, there's more evidence that it's harmful than paedophilia. And the great problem is, we, ever since 1997, embraced neophilia. And it's a catastrophe. But arguably, conservatism has always been this awkward compromise. Do you see what I mean? It's got no clear doctrine. It is, we don't much like change, but actually, you know, well, it's a bit of a good, well, we are a progressive country, aren't we, you know? And so it's always this negotiation. Do you see what I mean? It's always this negotiation. Now, that's what I think goes wrong at least twice, 3 times in the history of the Conservative Party. It goes wrong with Peel himself because he never comes up with really, if you read the Tamworth Manifesto, it's not actually a very exciting document. You have, first of all, this great concession. And then he sort of says, well, we're not going to have infinite change. But really all he says is, trust me. Trust the leader. Trust me to decide. And of course, that's not good enough. I would argue, and I'll just throw my hat in the ring on this, there's only ever been one person, and it's not Margaret Thatcher, who seriously defined conservatism, and it's Disraeli. Disraeli, who is the real founder of the party, the man who turns us into a mass party, the man who, by the Second Reform Act in 1867, recognises, as is now the case, that the right is naturally supported by a very large part of the working class. And what Disraeli does, he elaborates very subtly, very cleverly, in a speech given in Edinburgh in the latter part of 1867, when the great debate over the Reform Act was over. It had actually gone through Parliament. Remember, can you imagine, I'm using a microphone in this comparatively tiny room. I could actually, if I strain my voice, fill it, because I'm a good actor. But can you imagine filling the Free Trade Hall without amplification? Disraeli and those great 19th century politicians did it. In the case of Disraeli, I've had a couple of glasses of red wine. He had 2 bottles of brandy per speech. And ladies and gentlemen, the reason I'm so eloquent is the red wine is really quite good and the glasses were brim full, so the throat is well lubricated. But Disraeli's formula is really good. It's as follows. Listen very carefully, because this is the real text of what I want to say now. And this is the real text we should have as a party. In a progressive country, change is inevitable. And if you look in the dictionaries of quotations, that's where they stop. So you have Disraeli, the greatest conservative leader, saying change is inevitable. In other words, you turn him into a Tory wet. You turn him into a direct anticipation of, old fatty Soames, now rather thinny Soames, of David Cameron, of all the rest of them. But Disraeli isn't that. The quotation then continues. I'll begin at the beginning again. In a progressive country, change is inevitable. The question is, what kind of change? Will it be change in accordance with the history, the traditions, the feelings of the nation? Or will it be change in accordance with the abstract principles of international liberalism? And that is the catch. Change, as Disraeli brought about in 1867, when he recognized that if you broadened the franchise, you wouldn't destroy the political system, you would strengthen it. Because one of the remarkable things about our political system is, unlike that of anywhere else in Europe, that notion, remember, which goes back to Magna Carta, just to the aftermath. I just signed a copy, so clearly it's gone through somewhere. Going back to Magna Carta in 1215, 1216, from that point onwards, there is this key notion of what made, remember, the great achievement of England is we invent self-government. It's our political history. So much about English history matters, but the fundamental thing is you invent self-government. You invent responsible government. The idea that the governors answer to the governed, that the laws are yours because you participate in the making of them through Parliament in which everybody is represented. And that's the foundation. That idea should be the central principle, the idea of the nation, of self-government, of everybody participating in it. And of course, that idea proved flexible. You'd had an aristocratic constitution. It's broadened by 1832 to include the educated middle classes. It's broadened by 1867 to include my grandparents. In other words, the skilled working class. It's broadened at the end of the First World War, ladies, to include you. The most conflict, the idea that women could actually participate, should, because remember what's striking is, we all are told about the radicalism of the suffragettes. Yes, their methods were radical, but what were they wanting? They weren't wanting to tear down the Constitution. They weren't wanting to demolish Parliament. They wanted a place in it. And I know where you've wandered around in this wonderful bit of London. This is a particularly hideous building, by the way, that is a monument to the horrors of rebuilding of the 1960s. But if you turn left as you go out here and go into St. James's Square, if you go up straight on this side, you'll come to the headquarters now of another club, I think it's the Cavalry and Guards, which is in the house that Nancy Astor, the first female MP, had. And if you look at that, you see suffragettes were not a movement of the poor. It's one of the grandest and most elegant houses in London. It's the access of women fully into the governing class. So that's what Disraeli was saying, that anything that develops that is native to England. Anything that doesn't is a catastrophe. Let's just quickly now summarize where Thatcher gives us the example and then look at the particular nature, the particular horror of the mess that we find ourselves in now. The position is quite clear. From 1945 to 1979, we were effectively ruled by the wartime coalition, by a Conservative Labour coalition. In other words, that when Churchill comes to power in 1951, old, tired, disease-ridden, drunk, let's be absolutely honest on all of these things, he does nothing. He knew he should have begun to reverse. Remember, the catastrophe of British history is what the Attlee government did. It creates an unfunded NHS and an unfunded welfare system on the back of a broken, bankrupt wartime economy. It is demented. Nothing ever gets right from that point onwards. It's fundamentally irredeemable. What do we do? Nothing. We nowadays talk about the Uni Party. They then talked about Butskellism. They talked about Hugh Gateskill, Labour leader, Winchester, Winchester College, and they talked about Rab Butler, who I think was Eton, but I can't remember who was a Conservative. It was called Butskellism. And both parties believed in Keynesian economics, nationalisation, prices and incomes policies, government 5-year plans. The whole, we were practically indistinguishable from the Soviet Union until the crash of that was we again had a moment with Barber in 1972-73 when we had something very much like Liz Truss. Because what the Chancellor of the Exchequer does at that point, the Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, is to engineer a boom, as Liz Truss tried to do, to escape from the economic straitjacket. And I don't know how many of you were buying property at that time. I was. Property prices in London in 1972-73. Can anybody give me a quick guess as how much? No, they increased 3 times. They tripled. They tripled 3 times. That's the result of conservative economics. Right? And that's why you had Thatcher. That's why you had Thatcher. Why you have this notion, we've got to break. We've got to do something different. But ladies and gentlemen, I think with all Thatcher's greatness, and I do not deny it, I really do not deny it, she led conservatism down the blind alley. We became a party just of free market economics, and we're not. Conservatism has got to be about belonging, it's got to be about place, it's got to be about history, it's got to be about values. Yes, a properly run state is part of that. Yes, properly run public finance is part of that, but it's not all of it. And we lost sight of that bigger picture. And the result was, ladies and gentlemen, the cruelest thing of all, that Thatcher's victory was actually the moment of her defeat. Because in 1997, when Tony Blair was elected, and you may remember somebody else, a person of deeply dubious morals, you were saying I'm the rudest man, which is the greatest offence against English niceness. But the person, of course, in the politics of that period, who suddenly surfaced again is dear old Peter Mandelson. I know Peter quite well, I hate to say. The last time I saw him was the day before he flew to America to become ambassador, and I met him, at which point people go, well, don't tell where you met him. But I met him perfectly respectably in the Burlington Arcade, probably the most expensive shopping district in London, practically bent to his knees with the weight of the expensive shopping bags. But anyway, you may remember, Petey said he was perfectly happy with people being filthy rich, providing they paid their taxes. And the thing that stopped us realizing quite what happened in 1997 was the fact that Labour at that point more or less kept the Thatcherite view of economics going. But what happened at the same time, and I'm now deliberately choosing what will seem extravagant language, but I actually believe it. What happened in 1997 was a constitutional revolution, a slow burn constitutional revolution, which in scale and effect and in consequences is of the same as the French Revolution that was carried out in England, in Britain, and it has the same values, those same values of ruthless international liberalism, glued onto this great historic constitution with catastrophic consequences. And I can summarize very quickly, and I will do so because I've been on my feet quite a long time, and you will want, I'm sure, to come back at me. The fundamental principle was enunciated by Charlie Faulkner, the first Lord Chancellor of the new dispensation, in 2003. And he actually says it quite explicitly. You'll remember I said the fundamental principle of our Constitution, we call it the sovereignty of Parliament. It's the idea that the people make the laws through their own assembly, through Parliament, with the MPs being finally answerable to the people. And what Faulkner says in that speech is, perhaps this is not such a good idea, and that much of public decision-making should be away from the popular arena, and it should go in different directions. Now, what on earth leads you to say that? It is the desire, well, to be French, to be European, to follow in exactly the same direction as the states of Europe, which, remember, led by Germany and the constitution we gave Germany after 1945, fundamentally distrust the people because the people were blamed for electing the Nazis. So what we've got to realize, there are two completely different views of democracy. There is the European, the German view, that liberal democracy is about limiting the power of the majority to protect minorities, whereas Anglo-Saxon just still is the idea that democracy is, well, the rule of the majority. It's why you've had to invent the word populist. That's why which means exactly the same. One is Greek and the other is Latin. So what you can see then, New Labour do right from the beginning is to strip power away from Parliament, that's away from people you can control. And it goes in two directions. First of all, it goes to expert bodies, quangos, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisations. The most important is the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, which has scandalously mismanaged both the public finances, the currency, and particularly the sale of government debt in a shocking fashion since it acquired full independence. Then there is English nature, which is, of course, responsible for bat tunnels, £100 million tunnels to protect 3 or 4 bats. You know, just with HS2 deranged, and still worse, of course, the Climate Change Committee, which, if you were in on climate change and you were a friend of John Selwyn Gummer, you made a fortune out of it at the expense of the vast subsidies that lead to us paying 4 times the American price for electricity and the entire structure of our industry collapsing. And do you know how many of these quangos we've got? 444. The executive of any one of them, the tiniest paid some hundreds of thousands, the biggest paid 2 and 3 million, and between them controlling more than a third of state expenditure. That's in excess of £500 billion a year, not a single penny of which you control. Not a single one of them can you remove. Now, I know it's a problem, isn't it? When you say government by experts, doesn't it sound a good idea? There's a great Greek philosopher, Plato, thought about this. And you know what? He thought there should be ruled by experts. Again, at the end of a meal, I always say it's really appropriate to tell the story of Plato's great rival, who is Aristotle. And Aristotle, some of you will remember Gilbert and Sullivan, in fact. I imagine as well conservatives, lots of us remember Gilbert and Sullivan and that wonderful line in Iolanthe that every boy and every gal that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. But if you're interested in philosophy, you're either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. And Aristotle has got completely the different view about politics. At the end of a meal, it's very appropriate. He gives this wonderful analogy. The judge of the quality of a meal is not the cook, is not the expert, it's the eater. It's the person actually eating the meal. So, but we've got a really good example of the disaster of single-issue committee, which is COVID. We were ruled by a single-issue committee during COVID. It was even given this marvelously Platonic name, SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Board Executive, or whatever it was called. And ladies and gentlemen, there were quite decent people on it. There were also loons like Neil Ferguson of Imperial, who continued to gave wrong statistics on foot and mouth, gave wrong statistics on BSE, and even wronger ones on COVID. But there were people like Paul Nurse and whatever. But ladies and gentlemen, that expert committee had one purpose: to stop anybody dying of COVID. Do you know what? It didn't matter if you died of a heart attack. In fact, it was positively welcomed because you'd shut down the entire NHS and you'd turned it into a national COVID service. And by the way, can we all just be clear of the absurdity of this? Many of us are relatively elderly, would have been prime targets. What was the average age of death from COVID? 82. 82. What is the average age of death? 81. Get COVID, live longer. And think about it. This absurdity, what did we do? We destroyed the educational chances of 3 generations of school children, even though they had no chance of catching the disease. We did even worse. To have furlough, we bankrupted ourselves. We incurred the costs of a major war, literally the costs of a major war. And then finally, we destroyed the habit of work. We destroyed. So that's the result of single-person government. And then the final thing you do is you heave off government away in the other direction, experts in the one hand, and to lawyers on the other. And this is the other catastrophe. Traditionally, law is under Parliament. Parliament makes law. The judges are the lions under the throne. No longer. Judges have got ideas above their station. They've invented this thing called the Supreme Court. They've reinvented the idea of the rule of law. And above all, they've introduced catastrophes like universal human rights or European human rights. Now, they sound lovely, don't they? This is the problem. The left has captured language. I call human rights Paddington Bear. It's Paddington Bear political philosophy. You can just see human rights. They've got a little sort of red, sort of squashy pork pie hat, a pathetic little handwritten label round their necks saying Peru. They always lisp, of course, so it's Peru. They've got a little battered suitcase, and everybody waxes, wet and whatever. You know exactly what I'm trying to say. But ladies and gentlemen, universal human rights are a catastrophe. They're invented to destroy states. They lead to dispute between rival groups. And above all, they are designed to be anti-democratic. Think about it. If you believe that there are universal human rights, you believe there's a universal human being. You believe that somewhere we're all the same. Deep down, we're all so of course, the Afghan refugee, you know, may have had a bit of a rough experience. He may do the odd little bit of rape and pillage, but by the time he's settled down in Purley and the odd little girl has been sort of taught local habits, he'll be just like the rest of us. The lunacy, the insanity, but it's worse than that. If you believe in universal human rights, there should be no states. There should be no borders. There's no difference between the citizen and the foreigner. There's no impact of history. There's no impact of tradition. There is merely abstract equality, that deadly thing that Disraeli talked about. So that's what's happened with universal human rights. And their immediate impact is brilliantly summarized by the man largely responsible for this, the last law lord, the last senior law lord, Tom Bingham. And he puts it safely in Australia, it has to be said, as follows. Human rights law, and I'm quoting, human rights law is anti-democratic insofar as it is counter-majoritarian and designed to protect minorities at the expense of the majority. And then he goes on and he lists the minorities, beginning with the mentally sick, Rudakabana, Kalokane, the people who should be in secure mental hospitals, not performing acts of horror. We, ladies and gentlemen, went along with all of that. The Cameron government declared itself the heirs of Blair. It is under Cameron that we introduce non-crime hate incidents. It is Theresa May who legislates net zero. It is under Theresa May and Maria Miller that the beginnings of gender self-identification take place. Until the Conservative Party does what the Conservative Party did with Keith Joseph and Thatcher, recognise its sins, repent, and explain why. Fun though this lunch has been, we are wasting our time. Any questions? Yeah. Got one here.
Yes, thank you so much for an excellent talk. I may respectfully suggest to you there are two fundamental differences between now in Britain and the 1970s. The first is the unprecedented economic competition from Asia, which is a dampener upon wages and the fundamental basis of financing the welfare state. And the second is the enormous white elephant in the room that the pseudo-left political correctors don't want to talk about. That is Islamic fundamentalism due to the demographic shift in this country towards the Muslim population. Would you care to comment upon those?
Yes, I mean, again, what I'm suggesting is that we recognise any incoming government of the right, and I think in practice we will have to work towards a broad right-based coalition. That will be essential. I do not see anything else working. What I'm trying to do is to embark on a process of policy development. And we need to recognise there will be a huge resistance. Because what I've described, the quangos, the legal system, and of course much more, the universities, the civil service, most of the commentariat, whatever, they're all signed up to what you call woke. They will resist to the last, if they have any blood in their veins, and there's not much sign of it, they will resist to the last, evil-smelling drop of whatever passes for blood in their veins. So you've got to prioritize. And it seems to me that actually the reason that the immigration has happened, the reason that we've been unable to develop industry properly, well, partly Thatcher. I mean, Thatcher's, remember, decision that we were going to go essentially with, and exacerbated under Blair, that we were going to go essentially with a financialised economy, abandon industry. And that's already, I'm a northerner. That was already, I'm afraid, factored in. and it will have to be unfactored if we're to get anywhere. But the reason all these things are so pernicious is they're embedded in this legal structure that I've talked about. Woke is not a doctrine that persuades. Woke is absurd. The idea that simply by saying, you know, hey, I'm a woman, you will suddenly become a woman is simply madness. Isn't it? It's literally the stuff of madness. If a man says that, he should be in a mental hospital. If you're saying you're Napoleon, you know, we look at you kindly and say, there, and reach for the nearest tranquilizer and a straitjacket. We should do exactly the same. It's simply mad. Again, left-wing economics are deranged. But the reason they're so powerful is not they command by reason. It is that there is an entire political and legal structure that supports them. And until we break that legal structure, you will get nowhere. Yep. This is what I'm trying to drive home to people. So it's all, you know, I'm very close friends with the sort of people who are running the New Culture Forum, the Free Speech Union and all the rest of it. But you can't, indeed Douglas Murray, but you can't just tackle the culture by the culture. Persuading people will make no difference. What you've got to do is to change the law. The first job we have to do is change the law. This was the genius of Blair. This is why the country, which in terms of its history should have been most resistant to this kind of rubbish, was completely taken over and defeated, because the law embodies this stuff. The law, as I gave you, what the most influential single lawyer, Bingham, said about human rights. They're counter-majoritarian. The idea of two-tier justice isn't just the odd, you know, silly, arrogant policeman, or more typically policewoman, especially one wearing a hijab. It is actually written into the law. It's actually, we have two-tier law. And until we un-two-tier, you're all very genteel, but I'll use the language I've been using to reform. Until we unfuck what Blair did, we will get nowhere. In other words, there's got to be priority. In the same way Thatcher prioritized. You can't do everything at once. And we can't change the world outside.
How can we do it? How?
Well, I've just... wouldn't it be a good idea first to say, well, A, admit where we got it wrong, and B, to put it in, perhaps we might have a leader which would say the odd thing that I'm indicating, you know. Perhaps a leader that said, you know, well, actually, we were responsible for non-crime hate incidents. That was probably a mistake. Rather than have, again, you were talking about immigration, rather than having Boris Johnson lie, no, for the first time. I mean, how could anything, you know, in saving of an untruth, sully those pure lips, you know, recently kissed by Carrie? I mean, you know, sorry, what have we done? We've completely failed to take the initiative. And I mean, again, what I'm doing, I'm working any of you have been looking at the stuff that I've done online, I've been working very closely with the Prosperity Institute, who are otherwise known as Legatum. They're one of the great city hedge funds, Dubai-based hedge fund. They've vast amounts of money. And what we've done, we've set up a unit to deal with the drafting of the repeal legislation. We have a brilliant young lawyer who, again, interestingly, is a very anglicised Sikh young chap called Amajit Yoha. And they are working on the detailed drafting of legislation, drawing on the best people in Oxbridge and elsewhere to come up with it. And this will be a degree of preparation for government that is the equivalent of the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. If you remember the great difference of Trump 2, Trump 1 was a disaster, just sort of Trump unfiltered, which is a disaster. And Trump 2 was that extraordinary moment in which, think back to January, you see him being sworn in the rotunda of the Capitol. A few moments later, he's sitting at the Resolute desk, given, of course, by Victoria to the American president, at that desk there with that mysterious man, Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff behind him, who's been working flat out for the last 4 years drafting executive orders. And there's that vast pile of executive orders. And what Trump is ready to go from minute one. We don't have executive orders, but we need a similar legislative program. And again, there's got to be that willingness to do what Trump did, which is to seize the moment. The British Prime Minister, as Thatcher showed very clearly, as Churchill at his best showed, as Lloyd George, as all the great Prime Ministers, you have Blair, you have quasi-monarchical power if you've got the confidence, if you can command Parliament. You can do it. We've got to have a leader like that, otherwise we're lost. There's nobody, well, at the moment, the front runner, and again, I always say that I am a whore. I advise anybody, and I'm a very bad whore because I don't even charge. I don't think I've charged you. But I am advising Farage. He's the front runner at the moment. I do it without, I remain a member of the Conservative Party. I do it without particular hope. You cannot choose your instrument in politics. The electorate does. I've already, if you look at, I did a really interesting discussion with Gawain Towler of Reform on the eve of the Reform conference, in which I put all my reservations about Nigel. I've known him for about 30 years because my colleague at LSE, Alan Sked, was the first founder of UKIP, and of course there's this saga of ruptured relations. He may be. I don't think he's obvious prime ministerial material. I think we have a chance in somebody like Robert Jenrick, who is by far the most, people are not shaking their heads. There will be different views. But at the moment, well, we'll see the party conference. I mean, we are not in a position as we were in '75, where there was that moment of change. You see, Kemi has shown no sign of grasping these things, it seems to me. And also there's another great problem. There's been no break. The very fact that Ted Heath threw his sulk, that gigantic sulk, meant there was Thatcher didn't need to do anything. Ted going around, making a nuisance of himself. Everybody knew there'd been a break. Sorry, I'm going on too much. Right, somebody else? Yeah. Take a microphone over there.
Thank you very much. It seems that everything moves much quicker now than in the 1970s, and I do agree with you. I think that the Starmer government reflects the Heath government in many ways. I suspect things will have to get worse before the sort of leader charges in and changes things for the Tories or Reform Tories if it's a combined mix. Would you agree that we probably have certainly the remainder of this government, possibly even a bit longer, before Britain will see sense and finally turn its back on what's been going on?
Quickly.
Let's get down very quickly.
Short answer is no. I think that remember, there is no doubt that the Starmer government will fail. It is clearly failing now. There's a very simple reason. It is the government of the blob, by the blob, for the blob. And once what it's shown is that even a government of the blob with this gigantic majority cannot run the country. It is clear that the system Blair created does not work because of judicial review, of constant intervention by judges, of the incompetence of quangos, of the gigantic cost of the thing, the fact that it's breaking the economy. I mean, what we've done is very typical. Rome did exactly the same thing. You create a governmental machine that's too big for the economy to support. That's what we have at the moment. And at the same time, there is no agreement on the necessary cuts. Rome, it was very simple. It was when Caracalla doubles the wages of the Roman army in 260. Rome never recovers. from that point. We must hope that, I mean, it's essentially Gordon Brown's decision that everybody had to receive welfare. His idea was that you could only keep the welfare state going, give everybody, even, this is when you start giving people on hundreds of thousands a year child benefit. It's when you give pensioners like me winter fuel allowances and free television licenses. This entire insanity, exacerbated by COVID, exacerbated, I'm afraid, by people like Ian Duncan Smith. Can you imagine a Conservative creating something called universal credit? It's deranged.
I don't mean it's going to take 10 years, but you might have two governments within a...
Well, no, it could be. But what remember, we are seeing the 70s accelerating. Yeah. I think that we're already on the point of a bond crash. And at the same time, it'll be something very much like, we've seen again the beginnings of a winter of discontent within the public sector. It's 76 and 77 melding, and 79 melding into each other. But the problem is we are not ready. No. We are not ready. And it seems to me this chance is being thrown away.
Yes.
Yep. And then we'll go back over there.
When Thatcher ceased to be Prime Minister, she was asked what her greatest achievement was, and I'm sure she said many things, but one prominent thing was that she changed the mind of the opposition. You've mentioned it, Blair carried on her fiscal policies. And then when Cameron came in, he said that he was the heir to Blair. I just wonder if you had any inkling or knowledge even, or experience of why he didn't notice what Blair had done in terms of siphoning power away from Parliament into those quangos, and why, if he did notice it, why he didn't do anything about it.
I think the answer is that Cameron believed in it. I'm sorry, I think this is what...
He was the one that told the truth.
Pardon?
He was the heir to Blair.
I think Cameron was the heir to Blair. I think that this was quite deliberate. I mean, again, look at Theresa May. Can you imagine is this actually, yes. Can you imagine a Conservative leader who calls their own party the nasty party and stands on the steps of Downing Street saying that she regrets the bitter wrongs of the country? I mean, Conservative Prime Minister to talk about bitter injustices. She is the one who introduces DEI into the civil service. Yeah. It's completely deranged. The problem is the zeitgeist. It's the feeling of the times, and people go with it. But I think the fundamental question is that the belief that so long as there was something like free market economics, that was all right. And again, there's been some very interesting stuff being done there's amazing stuff online if you just look. And there's been some very interesting stuff quoting Roger Scruton. And Scruton, again, it is, I think, the problem that the dominant figures who've tried to define conservatism, like Michael Oakeshott and Roger Scruton, have been philosophers. And they've talked about feelings, belongings, all of this, dare one say, terribly airy-fairy stuff. Conservatism is a political thing. We forgot the important, again, the Constitution, it sounds dull and dry. It's not. The Constitution is the kind of quintessence of our history. It's the point at which that historical experience of a people shapes their present and determines their future. We've completely lost sight of that. In other words, there's been a terrible death of proper conservative thought. We all praise figures like Edmund Burke and whatever. Edmund Burke is a genuine radical. He says what I say about the French Revolution. If you read what he says about the French Revolution, it's identical to what Blair did. You root everything up. You declare it's a new country. You try to alter the circumscriptions of government. You alter the law. You alter language. You introduce universal human rights. And it's destructive, deliberately destructive. And we went along with it because we were foolish. But we're a party that's shallow. Its intellectual roots are shallow. Over to the, I think the far, yeah. Gentleman in the pink shirt.
One more question. Do you mind taking
No,
questions
I'm
after we've
delighted.
disbanded?
Yeah.
Isn't the real problem which we have to address in this room, our party is infected with the cancer of liberalism.
Yeah.
And until we can purge the party of that cancer, we will go nowhere. And if it is an impossible task to do that, should we not begin to coalesce around reform and forge together a genuine conservative movement?
Can I have the microphone? Sorry. I hope that turns out not to be the case. As you know, I have a very soft spot for reform. We've talked about this a lot. But I equally value the history and the traditions of the Conservative Party. And I think they are essentially noble, and they've mattered, and I don't like destroying things. I think destroying things is a really bad idea. That's what the left does. The left likes smashing things up, and it's very bad at creating. What I want to do is a restoration. I want to bring back and I want to restore. But until, this is where I agree with you, until we make plain to those who are leading the party that what they're doing is wholly inadequate, we are at risk, I'm afraid, of what you suggest not being a course of action that we choose, but being the only available course of action. It's very simple. And we've very little time. Because, again, the enormous difference from the 70s, Thatcher had time. Yeah. It was the left that was divided. You had the rise of the Social Democrat Party, you had the split of Labour. Admittedly, I think Labour is at the point of splitting again, and there's the added excitement of the Islamic fringe as well. And indeed, when I'm being really naughty, I refer to the resulting party, you know, the your party, our party, whatever else it is. I refer to it as the fruit, nut and chalk party, which gives you a very clear idea of its composition. But unfortunately, the main split is us. I mean, if you actually look at the latest opinion polls, if we were able, which we should be able on the basis of policy, to reunite on the right, we're at a clear 45%, which is a sweeping majority in a first past the post system. But again, there's got to be I think, for me, and this is why I've spent the time talking entirely in policy terms and entirely policy analysis, the only way there will be union on the right if there's a union that begins in policy. You can't do it by a negotiation between precious personalities. Of course you can't, but on the basis of policy, you might be able to do so.